please subscribe and share for more story. Margaret Bell didn't hear the words right away. They slipped into the hallway like casual dust, light and careless, as if they didn't carry the weight of a lifetime. "You're just not a priority anymore, Mom," Daniel said, his voice calm, almost bored. "Things are different now." Margaret stood frozen near the coat rack, gripping the ceramic handles of the baking dish in her hands. The heat from the oven mitts pressed into her palms, grounding her to the moment. Inside the dish was her spinach and cheese casserole, Daniel's favorite since he was a teenager. She had made it without thinking, the way she always did. Automatically, lovingly. For a few seconds, her mind went blank. Not angry, not sad. Empty. "I didn't mean it badly," Daniel added from the living room. "It's just reality." Reality. The word echoed. Margaret looked down at the dish, as if it belonged to someone else. 42 years of motherhood suddenly felt like an outdated job description. She had raised Daniel alone since he was 12. She had learned to survive exhaustion, loneliness, and fear. But this quiet dismissal felt unfamiliar. They didn't know she was there. She hadn't announced herself. She still had the spare key, after all. She always had. Margaret shifted her weight slowly, careful not to make a sound. The spare key sat heavy in her pocket, colder than it had ever felt before. She had used it for years, school pickups, emergency babysitting, last-minute favors. Back then, the key meant trust. Now it felt like proof she had overstayed her place. From the living room, another voice joined Daniel's. "She just shows up," said Lauren, his wife. Her tone was tight, irritated. "With food. With opinions. With that look like she owns the place." Daniel sighed. "I know. I've talked to her." Margaret's breath caught. "You were clear?" Lauren pressed. "Yes," he replied. "I told her we need space. That you and I come first now. She needs to step back." Step back. Margaret leaned against the wall, the plaster cool against her shoulder. She wasn't being misunderstood. She was being managed, reduced, reclassified. She wasn't a mother anymore. She was an inconvenience. Her hands shook, but her body moved on instinct. She turned quietly, walked to the front door, and opened it with painful slowness. The latch clicked shut behind her, soft as a sigh. She placed the casserole gently on the doormat, like a forgotten delivery, and walked away without looking back. The drive home felt hollow, as if the world had been drained of sound. Margaret turned off the radio the moment it came on. She couldn't stand cheerful voices or forced laughter. The only noise was the low hum of the engine and the familiar rattle of the aging sedan. It was the same car she had bought 12 years earlier, for Daniel. He had needed something reliable after college, something safe. When money grew tight, she kept it herself and told him it was temporary. Somehow, temporary became permanent. At a red light, Margaret rested her forehead against the steering wheel. "You're not a priority," she whispered. Saying it aloud made it heavier. When she finally reached her small house, the silence inside felt different. Not peaceful, suffocating. She filled the kettle and placed it on the stove. When it began to whistle, the sound pierced the room like a scream. She sat at the round kitchen table, tracing a worn chip in the wood with her finger. The house hadn't changed. Same curtains, same smells, same quiet, but something inside her had shifted. Her eyes drifted to the wall of framed photos. Daniel at 5, missing teeth and smiling wide. Daniel at 17, tall and unsure. Daniel at his wedding, her face half-cropped from the picture. Her life, neatly arranged. Or so she had thought. Margaret had raised Daniel alone after his father left in 1999. No explanations. No goodbye. Just a closed door and unpaid bills. She never let Daniel feel abandoned, even when she herself felt broken. She worked double shifts as a hospital clerk and cleaned offices at night. Sleep was optional. Providing was not. She paid for private tutoring when he struggled in school. She covered his first failed business idea with a quiet loan of $9,500. She co-signed his second car. When Daniel and Lauren bought their house in 2016, Margaret had emptied a retirement account to help with the down payment. And when their children arrived, Sophie first, then Lucas, Margaret rearranged her entire life. She watched them after school.
Cooked. Cleaned.
Filled gaps no one else noticed. She never asked for recognition. Not a birthday call. Not a seat at the head of the table. At holidays, she often sat on a folding chair near the hallway. "It's fine," she always said. But invisibility was different. This wasn't neglect. This was dismissal. That night, the tears didn't come. Instead, something colder settled into her chest. Clear, steady, and unfamiliar. Margaret stood, walked to the corner cabinet, and opened the drawer she hadn't touched in years. Inside the drawer were documents she had carefully ignored, bank statements, old check stubs, and a thick folder labeled Daniel. Her handwriting was neat, deliberate. She spread everything across the dining table, the way she used to spread homework papers when Daniel was young. "This isn't love anymore," she said quietly to the empty room. She began to count. Tuition assistance, medical bills, childcare costs, cash transfers. The numbers added up faster than she expected. Over the years, the total reached just over $168,000. Margaret stared at the figure, stunned. She had never seen it that way before. To her, it had never been money. It had been safety, opportunity, love. She sat back in her chair as the realization settled. And still, she wasn't a priority. She didn't sleep that night. She watched the streetlights outside cast long shadows across the lawn. She thought about her will. Her house was paid off. Her savings modest but stable. Enough to matter. "If I don't matter now," she whispered, "why should I later?" For the first time in decades, Margaret allowed herself to think the unthinkable, not with anger, but with clarity. Something had to change. And this time, the change would not be loud. It would be deliberate. Morning arrived without rest. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed long before the alarm rang, the pale light slipping through the curtains and settling on the floor like an unwanted witness. Daniel's words replayed in her mind with cruel clarity. Not a priority. She made coffee the way she always had. Instant, strong, no sugar. Daniel used to tease her about it. "You drink sadness in a mug," he once joked. She had laughed then. Now the mug only warmed her hands, not her chest. When it was empty, she walked to the old secretary desk she had inherited from her mother. Its drawers stuck slightly, swollen from age and humidity. Inside was the accordion file she used to track what she called little helps. She laid the papers out carefully. A remaining balance on a car loan, $3,600. Tuition payments for Lauren's certification course, $11,200. Braces for Sophie, $6,900. A short-term business loan Daniel never repaid, $8,000. And the largest contribution of all, the house down payment, $38,000. Then there were the monthly deposits into the children's education accounts. Over 7 years, that totaled another $17,400. Margaret pressed her lips together. She had called these gestures love. But love, she was learning, could be mistaken for permission. The mail arrived just after 10. Bills. Flyers. Then a thick cream envelope with raised lettering caught her eye. "You're invited to celebrate the opening of Lauren Hayes' studio." Margaret stared at it for a long moment. She remembered writing the first check that helped pay for the business license. Remembered Daniel saying, "We couldn't do this without you, Mom." She slid the invitation beneath a stack of old newspapers without opening it. Around noon, the walls felt too close. She pulled on her walking shoes and a beige cardigan and headed for the community park. The air smelled of grass and pond water. Joggers passed. Children laughed near the swings. Margaret sat on a bench near the playground, the same bench where Daniel had once taken his first unsteady steps toward her. She could still feel the weight of a small body when he fell into her arms, laughing. Back then, she had believed love only grew. Sitting there now, she felt grief, not sharp, but deep and aching, for the man that child had become. When she stood to leave, Her resolve felt firmer. Whatever came next, she would not return to being unseen. Back home, Margaret picked up the phone and dialed her bank. North Shore Trust, a cheerful voice answered. "How may I help you?" Margaret cleared her throat. "I'd like to speak to a personal banker about suspending my automatic transfers and reviewing the power of attorney on my accounts." There was a pause, then a click. A man named Thomas came on the line. He verified her information, his tone polite and professional. "I see several recurring payments," he said. "Utilities assistance, education funds, insurance premiums." "Yes," Margaret replied. "I want all of them suspended. Effective immediately." He hesitated. "All of them? Every one?" Another pause. "Mrs. Bell, would you like time to reconsider?" Margaret smiled faintly. "I've had decades," she said. "I'm just acting now." "Understood," Thomas replied. "You'll need to come in to sign the final paperwork." "I will," she said. When she hung up, the house felt different. Not empty. Lighter. She made herself a sandwich and ate it at the dining table where holidays used to be loud and crowded. She let the memories surface, then gently pushed them aside. That evening, she pulled out the folder marked estate planning and placed it on the desk. Tomorrow, she would make another call. The law office smelled of polished wood and old books. Margaret had been there many times before, always on Daniel's behalf. Arthur Caldwell greeted her with a nod. "What can I do for you, Margaret?" She slid the folder across the desk. "I want to update my will." He opened it, scanning quickly. "Anything specific?" "Yes," she said. "I want to remove my son as the primary beneficiary. I want the majority of the estate placed into a trust for my granddaughter, Hannah." Arthur's pen stopped midair. He looked at her carefully. "Is this recent?" Margaret met his gaze. "It's overdue." He didn't argue. He explained options, revocable trusts, protections, contingencies. The clinical tone steadied her. Being treated like a capable adult felt like oxygen. As they spoke, Margaret thought of Hannah. Quiet, thoughtful, the only one who visited without being asked. Hannah listened. She remembered birthdays. She wore the silver locket Margaret had given her 3 years ago, every day. She deserved a future free from pressure and expectation. "We'll finalize everything within the week," Arthur said. "And the power of attorney?" Margaret nodded. "Remove Daniel." Arthur hesitated briefly, then wrote it down. When Margaret stepped back into the sunlight, she felt strangely calm. Margaret stopped at a small bakery on her way home and bought herself a single peach tart. It felt indulgent. At home, she made tea and ate it on the porch, watching neighborhood children ride their bikes in uneven circles. For the first time in years, she felt like herself, not just a mother, not a resource, but a woman with a name. The phone rang around 6. She recognized Daniel's number and let it ring twice before answering. "Hey, Mom," he said, too cheerful. "We were thinking about brunch this weekend. Hannah will be there." Margaret could picture Lauren nearby, listening. "I'll check my calendar," she said calmly. There was a pause. "You sound different," Daniel said. "I feel different," she replied. Silence stretched. "Okay," he said finally. "Let me know." After hanging up, Margaret stared at the phone. That night, sleep didn't come easily, but it wasn't anxious. It was alert. She sorted through old boxes, letters Daniel had written from college, photos, journals. One note read, "Thanks for the help, Mom. I couldn't have made it without you." She folded it carefully and placed it back in the box. Sometime near dawn, Margaret found the sweater she had been knitting for Hannah. Pale blue wool, half finished. She picked up the needles and worked steadily as the sky lightened. By the time the sun rose, one sleeve was complete. Saturday brought an unexpected knock. Margaret opened the door to find Hannah standing there with a small paper bag. "Hi, Grandma," she said softly. "I brought scones." Margaret stepped aside without a word. Hannah moved easily through the kitchen, setting plates, pouring tea. After a long silence, she spoke. "Dad's upset," she said. "He says you froze the accounts." Margaret met her eyes. "Do you think I'm wrong?" Hannah shook her head. "I think you waited too long." Margaret smiled, tears pricking her eyes. Hannah reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You've given enough," she said. "I see it. Even if they don't." The words settled gently, filling a space Margaret hadn't known was empty. Hannah stayed until noon. They talked about books, classes, a boy she liked who played guitar, and wore too many rings. When she left, Margaret watched her walk down the street and wave back once. That small gesture filled her with a quiet warmth. Later that afternoon, Margaret remembered it was Lauren's birthday. For years, she had bought flowers, spa vouchers, thoughtful gifts. This year, she had done nothing. And for the first time, she felt no guilt. At 7, the phone rang. She didn't answer. At 7:30, a text appeared. "Just checking in. Hope you're okay." Margaret opened a drawer and found an old notebook. On one page, she had once written, "They only love the part of me that gives." She stared at it, then picked up a pen and wrote beneath it, "Let them learn to love the part that chooses." She closed the notebook gently. The house was quiet, but it no longer felt lonely. Sunday morning arrived gently, almost apologetic. Margaret woke later than usual and allowed herself to linger in bed, listening to the distant hum of traffic and the ticking clock in the hallway. There was no rush, no obligation waiting to be fulfilled. She made oatmeal, ate slowly, then carried her mug to the living room where sunlight pooled across the rug. The notebook from the night before sat on the coffee table. She opened it again and reread the sentence she had written. "Let them learn to love the part that chooses." The words felt solid, earned. She thought about how often she had mistaken endurance for virtue, how she had trained herself to stay quiet, to adapt, to absorb discomfort so others wouldn't have to. That skill had kept her family afloat for years, but it had also erased her edges. She stood and opened the curtains fully, letting light flood the room. "I'm still here," she said aloud, testing the sound of it. It felt strange, almost rebellious. She spent the afternoon tending to small things, watering plants, folding laundry, dusting shelves. Ordinary tasks, but they felt different now. Intentional. Chosen. Not done in anticipation of praise or need, but simply because she wanted her space to feel cared for. That distinction mattered more than she expected. Midweek, Margaret walked into the bank branch to sign the paperwork. The lobby was cool and quiet, the kind of place where voices naturally lower themselves. Thomas, the banker she'd spoken to on the phone, greeted her politely. "Everything's ready," he said, sliding the documents across the desk. Margaret read each page carefully. The suspension of transfers. The removal of Daniel as authorized decision-maker. Each signature felt deliberate, grounding. When she finished, Thomas hesitated. "May I ask," he said gently, "if you'd like these changes kept confidential?" Margaret looked up. "Yes," she replied. "For now." Outside, the day was bright and brisk. She treated herself to lunch at a small cafe she'd passed dozens of times, but never entered. Sitting alone by the window, she realized how long it had been since she had made plans without checking if someone else needed something first. That evening, Daniel called again. This time his voice lacked cheer. "Mom, the utility payment didn't go through," he said. "There must be a mistake." Margaret leaned back in her chair. "There isn't," she said calmly. "We'll talk later." She ended the call before he could argue. Her hands were steady. The following days were quiet. No dramatic confrontations. No apologies. Just space. Margaret used it carefully, like fragile glass. She returned to knitting the sweater, completing the second sleeve while listening to an old radio program. She rearranged the photo wall, removing a few frames and replacing them with landscapes she loved: oceans, forests, open skies. It felt symbolic, though she didn't dwell on it. One afternoon, she received an email from Lauren's business account thanking family supporters for believing in the brand. Margaret deleted it without replying. She felt no anger, only clarity. On Friday evening, Daniel showed up unannounced. She watched him through the window before opening the door. He looked tense, older somehow. "We need to talk," he said. Margaret nodded. "We do." They sat at opposite ends of the couch. "You blindsided us," Daniel said. "You cut us off." Margaret met his gaze. I stopped overextending myself, she corrected. There's a difference. He frowned. You didn't even warn us. You didn't warn me when you decided I wasn't a priority, she replied softly. The room went still. Daniel ran a hand through his hair.
That wasn't what I meant, he said.
You're twisting things. Margaret shook her head. I heard you clearly, she said. And I finally believed you. He opened his mouth, then closed it. We were just trying to set boundaries, he said. Margaret nodded slowly. So am I. The simplicity of it seemed to unsettle him. He looked around the room, as if searching for leverage. What about everything you've done for us? He asked. Doesn't that count? Margaret inhaled deeply. It counts, she said. But it doesn't give anyone permission to dismiss me. He was quiet for a long moment. You're punishing us, he said finally. Margaret stood. No, she replied. I'm protecting myself. He left shortly after, frustration heavy in his posture. When the door closed, Margaret didn't collapse. She didn't cry. She simply stood there, breathing, aware of the strength it had taken to remain calm. That night, she slept deeply, uninterrupted. A week later, Arthur Caldwell called to confirm the estate documents were ready. Margaret went in the next morning and signed them without hesitation. As she handed back the pen, Arthur studied her briefly. You seem lighter, he said. Margaret smiled. I am. On her way home, she stopped at the bookstore and bought 3 novels she'd been meaning to read. That afternoon, Hannah called. Dad's upset, she said quietly. But he'll be fine. Margaret chuckled softly. We all will, she replied. They talked about school, about summer plans, about nothing urgent. When the call ended, Margaret sat by the window and watched the day fade. She realized something important then. She no longer needed her worth to be acknowledged, to feel real.
She knew it now.
Fully. Unapologetically. Life didn't become perfect. Daniel remained distant, cautious. Lauren stayed silent. But Margaret no longer waited. She filled her days with intention, morning walks, library shifts, long dinners eaten slowly. She finished Hannah's sweater and wrapped it neatly, not as a peace offering, but as a gift freely given. On a quiet evening, Margaret returned to the notebook one last time. She read the sentence again and smiled. The woman who had written the first line had been tired, hopeful, invisible. The woman who wrote the second had chosen herself. Margaret closed the notebook and placed it back in the drawer, not as something hidden, but as something complete. Outside, the streetlights came on one by one. Inside, she felt whole. Life didn't become perfect. Daniel remained distant, careful with his words, as if every conversation were a negotiation. Lauren stayed silent. But Margaret no longer waited for invitations or explanations. She filled her days with intention, morning walks that stretched a little longer each week, volunteer shifts at the library where no one needed anything from her except attention, dinners eaten slowly at the table instead of standing at the counter. She finished Hannah's sweater and wrapped it neatly, not as a peace offering, but as a gift freely given. On a quiet evening, Margaret returned to the notebook one last time. She reread the sentence she had written and felt no urge to add more. The woman who had written the first line had been tired, hopeful, and unseen. The woman who had written the second had chosen herself. Margaret closed the notebook and placed it back in the drawer, not as something hidden, but as something finished. Outside, the streetlights flickered on. Inside, she felt steady. The following month brought small tests. Daniel called with careful politeness, asking questions that hovered just short of requests. How are you doing? He asked once. Well, Margaret replied. And you? He mentioned expenses casually, a car repair, a scheduling conflict with the kids. Margaret listened without offering solutions. The silence on her end did the work she once rushed to do herself. Okay, Daniel said eventually. Just checking in. When they hung up, Margaret noticed the absence of guilt. It surprised her. She had always believed guilt was the price of love. Now she understood it had been the cost of neglecting herself. She spent that afternoon reorganizing the spare bedroom, donating old boxes of things she'd kept, just in case. Each item placed in the donation pile felt like releasing a small obligation. That evening, she cooked for one and enjoyed it. Hannah visited again in early summer. She tried on the sweater and hugged Margaret without saying anything. The hug lingered, warm and unforced. "I got accepted into the program," Hannah said later, eyes bright. "Full scholarship." Margaret felt her chest swell. "I knew you would," she said. They celebrated with lemonade on the porch, talking about books and travel and the kind of future Hannah wanted, quiet, meaningful, her own. As Hannah left, she turned and said, "Thank you for choosing yourself, Grandma." Margaret watched her walk away, realizing how rare it was to be witnessed so clearly. That night, Margaret slept with the windows open, letting summer air move freely through the house. Daniel called less often after that. When he did, the conversations were shorter, more honest. There were no more assumptions, no more expectations. One afternoon, he said, "I didn't realize how much you were doing." Margaret paused. "You didn't need to realize it then," she said gently. "You just need to respect it now."
He didn't argue.
That felt like progress. Margaret ended the call and went back to her book. She no longer measured progress by apologies. Autumn arrived softly. Margaret planted mums in the front garden and trimmed the hedges herself. Neighbors stopped to chat. "You look good," one said. Margaret smiled. "I feel honest," she replied. She hosted a small dinner for friends, laughing easily, unburdened by the need to impress or provide. The house felt alive again, not because it was full, but because it was true. On a quiet afternoon, Margaret reviewed her documents once more, not out of fear, but reassurance. Everything was in order. She placed the folder back in its place and closed the drawer. She understood now that boundaries were not punishments. They were instructions for how she wished to be treated. When the holidays came, Margaret spent them differently. No folding chairs. No last-minute errands. She baked because she wanted to. She rested because she could. Daniel sent a card. Hannah sent a letter. Margaret placed both on the mantel. Equal in importance, neither waited with expectation. Margaret no longer waited to be chosen. She chose. And in doing so, she reclaimed a life that had always been hers, quiet, dignified, and whole. In the years that followed, Margaret learned something simple and profound. Love that costs your dignity is not love, it is labor. She still loved her son, but she no longer carried him. She spoke when she wished, visited when invited, and gave only what she could offer freely. The guilt that once followed her like a shadow faded into something manageable, then into memory. Her days became her own. Mornings were unhurried. Evenings were peaceful. She kept walking, kept reading, kept choosing herself in small, steady ways. When people asked how she was doing, she no longer softened the truth to make them comfortable. "I'm well," she said, and meant it. The house, once heavy with silence, now held a different kind of quiet, one that rested instead of pressed. Margaret understood now that being needed was never the same as being valued. And she had finally stopped confusing the two. On a clear afternoon not marked by any special date, Margaret sat on her front porch with a cup of tea, watching sunlight move slowly across the yard. Children laughed somewhere down the street. A breeze stirred the trees. Nothing extraordinary happened, and that, she realized, was the gift. She had spent decades proving her worth through sacrifice, through endurance, through giving until there was nothing left to offer. Now, her worth needed no proof. It simply existed. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, feeling grounded, complete. She had not lost her family. She had found herself. Thanks for watching. If you value stories of respect, dignity, and justice, please subscribe. It means more than you know, and it lets me keep sharing the lessons life has carved into me.